There are moments in life when we believe everything has been taken from us. Yet sometimes in the very instant we are most despised, a quiet door opens where no one expected it. They said she was too fat to be loved, a burden, a shame her family had to cast away. So they sent her off like unwanted cargo given to a poor farmer, as if her very existence were punishment. But what neither her family knew nor she herself was that this man was not merely scratching out a living on barren land. Behind his modest clothes and simple manner lay thousands of fertile acres, a thriving ranch, and most of all, a heart that saw the truth of who she was. What was missed was Sawa's curiosity about what comes next. Could a woman who had been rejected by the world finally discover that she was never a burden at all? Could love arriving so late in life be strong enough to bring her heart back to life after decades of silence and sorrow? Emotional spark, plus tragedy, plus curiosity behind it. On that first night in the wooden farmhouse when she entered with trembling hands and a soul scarred by years of rejection, he did not see a punishment. He saw a woman worthy of respect. But how could she believe him after so many lies, so many abandonments? And when the truth about the poor farmer begins to surface, what will it mean for a woman who had never dared to dream of such a future? This is not just a story about a woman and a farm. It is a story for anyone who has ever been cast aside, anyone who has felt not enough. It whispers that love and dignity may come late, but when they arrive, they can heal an entire lifetime. Would you like to hear the next part where the truth unfolds and a heart long starved of hope finds spring again? The wagon creaked under the weight of years, its wheels groaning, as though they too carried burdens too heavy to bear. Beside the cracked leather seat sat Eleanor, a woman whose figure had always been noticed before her heart ever was. 50 winters had etched fine lines around her eyes, and yet in the softness of her face lived a patience the world had never rewarded. Her father had once said she was born wrong, too broad, too heavy, too much for any man to want. As a girl, she'd learned to make herself small, folding into corners, speaking only when spoken to. Then came a marriage no one asked her about, to a man who treated her as one might treat a mule, useful when needed, scorned the rest of the time. He drank himself into the grave and left her nothing but debts and whispers from neighbors who said she should be grateful he'd taken her at all. Now sitting with nothing but a burlap sack and the echo of those cruel words, she found herself being carted away once more. Her brother had arranged it this time. Eleanor will help that poor farmer out there in the drylands. Better than her rotting away in town. In truth, he had bartered her presence for forgiveness on a gambling debt. The wagon jolted to a stop before a weathered homestead crouched against the vast Wyoming plain. From a distance it looked pitiful, fences sagged, paint peeled, windows clouded with dust. Eleanor's heart sank. She thought, so this is punishment, from one cage to another. Her brother hardly looked at her as he tossed her sack down. There he is, he muttered, jerking his chin toward the figure approaching from the corral. Your problem now, not ours. The man who came toward them was not young. His beard was streaked with gray, his shoulders broad but bent from work. He wore boots caked in mud, and his shirt bore patches mended by a steady hand. His face was hard to read, not cruel, not kind, just watchful. Name's Caleb Turner, he said, removing his hat. His voice was deep but quiet, carrying the cadence of someone unused to filling silence with unnecessary words. Eleanor's brother shook his hand quickly, pressed a folded slip of paper into it, and was gone before the dust of the wagon wheels had settled. For a long while, Caleb and Eleanor just stood there. The wind tugged at her shawl, lifting strands of graying hair. She waited for the disdain for the orders, for the look of disappointment men always carried when they saw her. Instead, Caleb only said, "You must be tired. Supper's near ready. Let's get you inside." His words fell like water into parched ground, unexpected, almost dangerous in their gentleness. As Eleanor followed him across the uneven yard, she told herself not to hope. Hope was a luxury she had been punished for before. But deep down, a small trembling question stirred. What if this place was not another prison, but the beginning of something else? The door to the farmhouse creaked as Caleb pushed it open, motioning for Eleanor to step inside first. She braced herself for the sour smell of neglect, the cramped spaces that mirrored the outside's weariness. Instead, she paused in the doorway, startled. The house, though plain, breathed of care. The wooden floors had been scrubbed smooth and clean, A fire crackled softly in the hearth, and the air held the fragrance of stew simmering with herbs. Curtains hand-stitched with small, careful embroidery framed the windows. It was not wealth, but it was dignity, and somehow that startled her more than grandeur would have. Caleb set her sack down gently near the stairwell. "Your room's up there first on the right," he said, his voice low, as though speaking too loud might disturb the quiet peace of the place. "It's yours to lock. Privacy matters." Eleanor blinked, uncertain. She had never been given a key to her own space before, not in her father's house, not in her late husband's. To be offered it now at 50 felt both bewildering and tender. At supper, she sat at a heavy oak table while Caleb ladled stew into her bowl. He didn't eat until she had begun. He didn't watch her with impatience or disgust when she lifted the spoon. Instead, he spoke gently about the land, the cattle, the fences, the storms that sometimes rolled down from the mountains without warning. Eleanor listened, her hands trembling slightly around the spoon. She was waiting for the bargain to reveal itself. Men didn't do kindness for nothing, not to women like her. But when she finally asked, "Why did you take me in?" Caleb only shrugged. "Loneliness makes a man foolish sometimes," he said honestly, his brown eyes meeting hers without hesitation. "But it also makes him see truth clearer. I heard you'd been cast aside by those who should have loved you. I figured maybe we'd understand each other." The words pressed against her heart like a balm and a wound at once. Understand each other. No one had spoken to her in such terms before. Over the next days, Eleanor discovered what her eyes had missed at first. The sagging fences belonged to acres upon acres of land, stretching farther than she could walk in a day. The cattle were strong, well-fed, marked with Caleb's brand. Behind the modest farmhouse lay barns, neatly kept tools organized with a craftsman's precision and storage full of supplies that could carry a family through the hardest winter. This was not the dirt-poor farm her brother had described. This was a life built on quiet endurance with roots deeper than appearances allowed. One evening, standing on the porch, Eleanor watched the horizon blaze with sunset, the light setting fire to the snow-capped mountains. Caleb leaned against the rail, silent beside her. For the first time in many years, she did not feel like a burden or a punishment handed from one man to another. She felt, though she hardly dared name it, like someone invited. Could a woman who had been given away like a debt ever truly belong somewhere by choice? The mornings on the ranch began with light spilling across the prairie gold and gentle brushing against the farmhouse windows. Eleanor would rise early out of habit more than eagerness and find herself in the kitchen before Caleb returned from tending cattle. The rhythm of brewing coffee, slicing bread, and stirring porridge gave her hands something to do while her heart wrestled with things she could not name. At first, she told herself she was only passing through, that this roof was merely a pause in a lifetime of being moved like unwanted furniture. She carried her brother's last words inside her like a curse. "No man will ever truly want you." Every kindness from Caleb cut two ways. When he pulled out a chair for her, her chest tightened with gratitude, yet her mind whispered, "He'll soon see through you." When he asked her thoughts about crop rotations or which cow looked near to calving, she offered her opinion, carefully terrified. He might laugh, but he never did. He listened as though her words carried weight. That frightened her most of all. One evening, as autumn winds rattled against the shutters, Caleb brought in a box of books. "Figured you might like these," he said, setting them on the table. Eleanor's breath caught when she lifted the lid. Old novels, poetry, even a Bible with worn pages, softened by many hands. "Why give them to me?" she asked quietly, almost defensively. Caleb tilted his head. "Because you look at things deeper than most folk. I thought you'd understand them better than I would." She turned away quickly, blinking back tears. That night, alone in her room, Eleanor opened one of the books, but the words swam. She wasn't crying because of loneliness. She was crying because of how much harder it was to accept tenderness after years of being denied it. Still, her fear followed her everywhere, as steady as her shadow. When Caleb's hand brushed hers at the table, she pulled away too quickly. When he lingered at the porch beside her, she found excuses to retreat indoors. And when he once hesitantly called her name, Eleanor, she answered with brisk, practical words to cover the trembling of her heart. One late afternoon, she caught her reflection in the farmhouse window, a stout, weathered woman with strands of silver in her hair, and lines around her eyes. She stared at herself for a long moment. "What could a man like him possibly see in me?" she whispered. The doubt was heavier than her suitcase had ever been. And yet that very night, as the coyotes howled in the distance, Caleb said gently across the firelight, "Sometimes what a man needs isn't a young beauty or a prize to be shown. Sometimes he just wants someone who knows how it feels to keep standing when the world's tried to push you down." His words lodged deep, but Eleanor's heart trembled on the edge of belief. Could he truly mean her? Or was she still only here because loneliness had cornered him? Could love really find a woman scarred by so many rejections, or would her fear drive it away before it ever took root? The prairie had a way of stripping life down to its bones. Long days under an endless sky wind that pressed against you until you either bent or broke, and nights so quiet that a single creak of the barn felt like thunder. For Eleanor, it became both a mirror and a forge. Each morning she rose with the sun, carrying her doubts like a weight tied to her chest. Yet every evening, as she laid her head down, some small piece of that weight seemed to loosen. Still fear clung stubbornly. She had been unwanted, too long used, like a tool cast aside like worn-out cloth. It seemed impossible that anything tender offered to her could be real. Then came the night of the storm. It rolled in from the west without mercy, lightning splitting the sky, rain slashing sideways, the wind howling through the canyons like an animal in pain. The cattle grew restless, pressing against the fences. Caleb rushed out to steady them, leaving Eleanor in the farmhouse, with Samuel, the old hired hand, who had been part of the ranch since before Caleb was born. But when a sudden crash shook the barn, Eleanor didn't think. She grabbed a lantern and ran into the night. Her dress clung to her body in the rain, and her boots sank into mud as she stumbled toward the commotion. Inside the barn, a pregnant mare had gone down, thrashing in terror. Caleb wrestled with ropes, trying to keep her from injuring herself. "Eleanor, get back inside," he shouted over the storm. But something in his voice, raw, desperate, ignited something in her that had been buried under years of humiliation. She didn't retreat. Instead, she planted the lantern on a beam, rolled up her sleeves, and moved to the mare's head. Her calm, low voice cut through the storm's roar. "Easy, girl. Easy now. You're not alone." She pressed her palm against the animal's neck, whispering, steadying. Slowly, the mare's thrashing slowed. Caleb glanced at her, water streaming down his face, and in that look was something Eleanor had never seen directed toward her before: trust. Together they worked until the foal was delivered, a trembling, fragile creature that blinked into the lantern's glow. Eleanor cradled its wet body in blankets while Caleb tended the mare. For a brief, sacred moment, the barn was silent, except for the sound of new life breathing. And in that silence, Eleanor felt something shift inside her. She had not been weak. She had not been useless. She had stepped forward when it mattered. Later that night, after the storm passed, Caleb found her on the porch, her hair damp, her hands still trembling from exhaustion. He sat beside her close enough that their shoulders brushed. For a long while he said nothing, just breathed with her, letting the quiet settle. Finally he spoke. "Do you know the first thing I noticed about you?" he asked. Eleanor's throat tightened. "That I was heavy, old, cast off." Caleb turned his eyes steady, kind. "No. The first thing I noticed was how you stood even when your own kin were trying to break you. You didn't bow your head. Not then and not now." She shook her head, tears threatening. "I've been nothing but a burden. Passed around. Paid off like a debt." "Why would you?" Because he interrupted gently. "You're the first woman I've met who knows how to stay. When the storm hit, you didn't run. You don't give up, Eleanor, and that's worth more than gold to a man like me." The words sank into her like rain into parched earth. For the first time, she let herself lean against him, just slightly enough to feel the strength of his presence. In the days that followed, something unspoken changed between them. Eleanor laughed more freely, though it startled her each time. She allowed herself to hum while she worked, filling the farmhouse with a warmth it hadn't known in years. Caleb sought her company in quiet ways, asking her to ride with him across the acres, or simply sitting nearby while she read aloud from one of the books he'd given her. But healing is rarely a straight path. One afternoon, while she hung laundry in the yard, a rider appeared on the horizon. Dust trailed behind the horse like smoke. As the figure drew closer, Eleanor recognized him, her brother. He dismounted, eyes sharp, mouth curled with disdain. "Well, look at you," he sneered. "Living soft, I see. Did he finally grow tired of pretending you're more than you are?" Eleanor's heart lurched, old wounds tearing open. She wanted to shrink, to hide. But Caleb stepped onto the porch, arms crossed, face calm but unyielding. "She's not pretending," Caleb said evenly. "She's exactly who she was meant to be, and she's mine because I chose her." The silence that followed was heavy, but it was Eleanor who broke it. For the first time in her life, she looked her brother in the eye without flinching. "You no longer have power over me," she said, her voice steady. "This is my home, and I belong here." Her brother's scowl faltered. Without another word, he turned and rode away. Eleanor's knees shook, but Caleb was already beside her, his hand steady on her shoulder. She realized then that freedom was not something given, it was something claimed. That evening, as the sky blazed with streaks of orange and violet, Caleb and Eleanor stood at the fence watching the mare and her foal graze. "Funny, isn't it?" Caleb murmured, "how storms bring new life." Eleanor nodded, her eyes soft with unshed tears. "Maybe that's what I've been waiting for all these years. A storm strong enough to wash the past away." He reached for her hand. This time she didn't pull back. That night, Eleanor sat at her small writing desk, a lantern flickering at her elbow. She opened a notebook Caleb had bought her and began to write. She wrote not of punishment or shame, but of belonging, of strength, of the way storms could carve valleys that later cradled rivers. She wrote because for the first time she believed her story wasn't ending in bitterness, it was opening into something new. Her words, though imperfect, were her own, and in them she saw herself not as a cast-off, but as a woman finally standing in the fullness of her worth. For Eleanor, the storm had done more than deliver a foal. It had unlocked a door she thought would always remain shut. But was she ready to step fully through into the love being offered to her? The first light of spring crept across the plains in soft gold, pushing away the icy grip of winter. Snow still clung to the shadows of the gullies, but the air carried a promise, now subtle, fragile but undeniable. For Eleanor, it was the first season she had welcomed with an open heart in many, many years. She stood on the porch that morning with a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, the boards creaking beneath her feet. Below, her calves bounded awkwardly across the pasture, their mothers calling after them with low, steady moos. The sight made Eleanor smile in a way that surprised her, an unguarded smile, not one hidden behind caution or fear. Behind her, she felt Caleb's presence before she heard him. He stepped outside, coffee mug in hand, his boots scuffing the wood. He didn't speak right away. He only leaned against the post beside her, watching the same sunrise. "Funny thing about land," he said finally. "It'll test you, beat you down, make you question whether you've got any right to claim it. But if you stay, if you stand your ground, it'll give back more than you ever thought possible." Eleanor's chest tightened at his words. He wasn't talking only about the ranch. She turned her gaze to him, searching his profile, strong and quiet in the morning light. For the first time, she let herself wonder, truly wonder if she could belong here, not just as a guest or an obligation, but as a partner. Her days grew richer with quiet purpose. She began keeping ledgers for Caleb's contracts, her sharp mind spotting errors that saved him money and earned his deep respect. She mended clothes with careful hands, not out of duty, but because she enjoyed creating something whole from scraps. She baked bread that filled the farmhouse with warmth, and though it was never perfect, Caleb ate it with a gratitude that made her blush. And then there were the children. Not hers, at least not yet, but the children of neighbors who often stopped by when their parents traded help with Caleb. They tugged at her skirts, asked her for stories, begged for cookies she pretended not to have until their eyes lit up at the reveal. Something inside Eleanor softened with every laugh, every small hand that slipped trustingly into hers. One afternoon, as she read aloud to two little girls curled against her on the parlor rug, she noticed Caleb watching from the doorway. His eyes weren't just warm, they were reverent. Later, when the children had gone, he said quietly, "You'd make a fine mother, Eleanor, a better one than most I've ever seen." Her heart lurched both with longing and with the ache of years lost. Could she still hope for such things at her age? Could love come not just as comfort but as renewal? The answer came sooner than she expected. One evening, as dusk fell purple over the fields, Caleb invited her for a ride. He saddled his sturdy bay horse and offered her the reins of a gentle mare he'd been saving for her. They rode in silence, the sound of hooves steady against the earth, until they reached a hilltop overlooking the ranch. From there, the land stretched endless fences like quiet lines of poetry across the prairie cattle, moving like brushstrokes in a living painting. "This is all yours," Caleb said softly. Eleanor blinked, startled. "Yours, you mean?" He shook his head. "No. Ours, if you'll have it that way." Her breath caught. She had been given to men before, bartered away like a sack of flour treated as currency for debts. But this was different. This was an offering, not a demand. Caleb turned toward her, his expression unguarded. "Eleanor, I don't want a helper or a housekeeper. I want you, as you are, with your strength, your scars, your stubborn heart. I want to build a life with you." Tears blurred her vision. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words tangled in her throat. For a moment, fear clawed at her, the old voices whispering she was too late, too old, too much of a burden. But then she remembered the storm, the foal, her brother's retreat, the laughter of children in her arms. She remembered Caleb's steady hand on her shoulder when she faltered, and something inside her answered before her lips did. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, Caleb. I'll stay. I'll build this with you." They rode back in silence, but it was the kind of silence that spoke louder than words. At the porch, Caleb dismounted first and helped her down. She stumbled slightly, and when his arms caught her, neither of them let go right away. The stars began to prick through the darkening sky. Somewhere in the barn, the foal whinnied, and the mare answered with a low call. Eleanor leaned against Caleb, her heart steady for the first time in decades. Hope, she realized, wasn't a sudden blaze of light. It was quieter than that, a steadier. It was the slow dawn after a long night. It was the warmth of a hand that did not let go. For Eleanor, hope had finally taken root in the soil of her heart. But hope is fragile. Could it withstand the trials that still waited beyond the horizon? The spring that followed was unlike any Eleanor had ever known. The air smelled of turned soil and wildflowers, and the Brennan Ranch, once a place she'd entered, with trembling hands and a heart full of doubt, had become something more than shelter. It was home. Word traveled fast across the prairie. Neighbors who had once whispered about the obese woman given to a farmer now saw her riding beside Caleb, managing accounts at the general store, and organizing suppers where laughter carried out onto the porch. Their curiosity turned to quiet admiration, though some struggled to understand how a woman of 50 could bloom so brightly when others her age faded into shadows. But Eleanor knew the truth. Love, real love, was not bound by numbers or years. It was bound by kindness, by choice, by seeing one another as whole. One bright Sunday, Caleb surprised her with a gathering. He had sent invitations to every family for miles, asking them to join for a barn raising and supper. Eleanor puzzled baked pies and roasted chickens, her hands busy, though her mind raced. By late afternoon, the yard was filled with wagons, horses, and voices. Music floated from a fiddle. Children chased one another through the grass, and the long tables groaned under food Eleanor had prepared with care. When the sun dipped low, painting the sky in orange and rose, Caleb called for quiet. He stood on the porch, hat in hand, his voice carrying with steady resolve. "Neighbors, friends, you know me well enough. You know this land, this house, this life we've built. But tonight I want you to know something more." He turned his eyes, finding Eleanor where she stood among the crowd. "This woman," he said, his voice rough with feeling, "was not given to me as punishment. She was given as a gift I never deserved. And I will spend the rest of my days proving worthy of her." A hush fell, broken only by the call of a meadowlark in the distance. Caleb stepped forward down from the porch until he stood before Eleanor. His hand reached for hers, and she felt the warmth of his palm steady her trembling. "I don't want just a partner in work or in name," he said. "I want a partner in everything. Eleanor, will you marry me, not because anyone demands it, but because we choose it?" For a moment, the world blurred, the years of rejection, the voices that called her unworthy, the lonely nights where hope seemed foolish. All of it fell away, leaving only this moment, the steady man before her, the faces of neighbors witnessing something true, and the sound of her own heart whispering yes. Her answer was quiet but strong. "Yes, Caleb. Yes, I will." Cheers rose, hands weak. The vows were spoken simply. No grand promises, no gilded words, just truth. "I choose you," Caleb said. "And I you," Eleanor whispered. And with that, their life truly began. Years passed gently like rivers winding through stone. Eleanor grew older, her hair silvering, but her heart only deepened in its joy. She found herself surrounded not by judgment, but by children's laughter, neighbors' trust, and the steady love of a man who had never once looked away from her. In the evenings when the prairie glowed beneath the sunset, she would sit on the porch beside Caleb. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they did not, but always she felt the truth humming inside her. Her worth had never been punishment, it had always been possibility. Eleanor's story reminds us love does not fade with years, nor is it reserved only for those the world deems worthy. Sometimes love comes late, but when it does, it blooms stronger than we ever imagined. In the quiet of that western evening, she finally realized something no one had ever told her. Before, her worth had never depended on the size of her body, her family's cruel words, or the circumstances that brought her to that farmhouse. It had always been there waiting to be seen, waiting for someone kind enough to reflect it back to her. And sometimes that reflection comes not from wealth or grandeur, but from the steady gaze of a good heart that simply says, "You are enough just as you are." This story reminds us that healing often comes later than we expect, and love doesn't always arrive in the form we imagined. But when it does, whether through a partner, a friend, or a community, it can transform the way we see ourselves and the world around us. If you carry old wounds, let this tale be a gentle whisper that it is never too late to be loved, never too late to discover your own dignity. Here on None, Wild West Saga, we share stories that remind us of resilience, tenderness, and hope. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to subscribe, share, and leave a comment. Tell us, would you like to hear the next chapter of this woman's journey? Or perhaps other stories of late blooming love and second chances? Your voice matters here, and sometimes sharing your thoughts might be the first step in writing your own new chapter.